we're going to continue on in our journey of fear, or fighting fear with fear, better stated. And just by way of review, just a high-level overview of what it is that we discussed last week. Last week, we discussed our struggles with fear, both as a society at large, particularly an American society, and also at the individual level. So we referenced our fear of spiders, of snakes, fear of a lack of preparation, and also, and perhaps most importantly for this study, of fear of man. And we considered briefly the biography of John Flavel, whose book Triumphing Over Sinful Fear this class is based on. We considered Flavel's context of fear, how he was not just familiar with fear from a theological perspective, but he was also familiar with fear contextually, situationally, experientially, really, as he himself ministered in a significant context of persecution. And we also considered his pastoral and theological credentials, how he is considered to be amongst most reputable pastoral theologians, the most well-rounded of the Puritans. We began to consider both the universality and the diversity of fear. So fear is something that everyone struggles with, weak and strong in faith. But it's also something that certain personalities may struggle with more than others. Remember, we discussed how Presbyterians, how Puritans use the term constitution to refer to disposition or personalities. We considered the scriptural basis for Flavel's text that he uses, or his departure point, a scriptural departure point for his book, and that was Isaiah 8:12-14, and also along with his mini-sermon or his outline for the entire text. And so today we're going to begin diving into the meat of the book, so to speak, by considering the distinctions that Flavel makes within the concept of fear itself. Flavel in his book distinguishes between three types of fear. There's natural fear, there's sinful fear, and there's religious fear. And within each of these, he defines the fear. He refers to its existential characteristics, how we experience fear, in a sense, what that looks like for us spiritually or psychologically within our own personalities and dispositions. And he also gives us examples, earthy examples, biographical examples, if you will, both biblical and within the history of the church itself. So first, let's go in by talking about natural fear. And first considering its definitions and descriptions. Essentially, Flavel first defines this natural fear as universal and connected to sin. He says on page 8 of his book, everyone experiences natural fear. And what is this? It is the trouble or agitation of mind that arises when we perceive approaching evil or impending danger. It's not always sinful, but it's always the fruit and consequence of sin. So in other words, ever since sin entered human nature, it's been impossible to shake off this fear. That's the first thing. The second thing that he says is that it is proportionate to evil. He doesn't necessarily use that term. That's my summary of it. It's proportionate to evil. He says on page 9 of his book that evil is the object of fear. The greater the evil, the stronger the fear. For this reason, the terrors of an awakened conscience, let's pay attention to this, the terrors of an awakened conscience are the greatest terrors. And now, just kind of want to add a qualifier here. When Flavel speaks of evil in this context, he's speaking of that which is destructive or has a negative recourse for the soul. So in other words, and maybe crassly stated, it's a bad experience. It's not necessarily an inherent wickedness, and when we get to our examples of Jesus experiencing natural fear, we're going to understand why it's not sinful, right? Jesus experiences natural fear, and obviously, and therefore it can't be sinful. Now, given that, why or what might he be saying? What might Flavel be saying when he speaks of the terrors of an awakened conscience being the greatest terrors? What might he mean by that? What is he saying by that? What is an awakened conscience? What is a conscience? I don't need a textbook definition. Just what do you think a conscience is? Okay? All right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay? Yeah. So, just picking out one, precise observation there, very correct observation. It is a matter of the heart, right? Interchangeably, oftentimes when the Puritans speak of conscience, they're referring to what we might say is heart or soul, right? A response of the heart or soul. But it's a very particular response, right? It's not necessarily just an issue of emotional response, detached from, it's a word that begins with an M or a word begins with an R. Say it again. Okay, so conscience is rational, that's for sure. It's not the one that I'm looking for, but it's reasonable, which goes along with ration, right? Righteousness or morality, right? Conscience is not divorced from an idea of what is right, what is proper, right? What is just that battle between right or wrong, good and evil. How many people have ever felt terrified because their conscience has been alerted? Augustine talks about in his Confessions an example with a pear. Can somebody tell me that? I know there's at least two of y'all that know this. Madison. Right. So Augustine was a thief. He stole pears with his buddies. He didn't even need the pears. He did it for the fun of it, right? But then later on, reflecting in his Confessions, right, there's a sorrow for that, right? There's, in a sense, a holy terror of that type of thing, right? But have you guys ever experienced, perhaps even just when being confronted with the law of God, the Ten Commandments, even more basic, have you ever felt the prick or the terror of conscience? Oh, that one nailed me right there. You're reading through the Ten Commandments. Or maybe even worse, you're reading through the larger catechism's explanation of the Ten Commandments. Then it gets pretty dicey, doesn't it? Right? You just feel this awakeness. Sometimes, there can even be a physiological response to this type of terror or this type of conviction, right? David speaks of physiological responses to his conscience being awakened, that he had transgressed the law of God. While I kept guilty silence, what? My bones wasted away, right? And we all know that feeling that guilt dries us up. Terror dries us up, particularly terror of conscience. Let's kind of hold on to that. Keep that in our minds. So the third thing that what's his name? Flavel. Farrell. I don't know why I'm thinking of Farrell. John, yes. Third thing that good old Johnny boy says is this third description is a varied experience, okay? A varied experience, all right? Not all constitutions, Flavel says, and temperaments experience the same degree of fear. Some people are naturally bold and courageous. They are like the lion in bravery and fortitude. Some people are exceedingly cowardly and faint-hearted. They are like the deer or the rabbit, Flavel says on page 11. And we'll get, when we look at our historical examples of that, we'll see what he's talking about a little bit further. Okay. Secondly, what is this experience? What is this existential effect, right, that fear has on our minds? And we've already discussed our bodies. First, the displacement of reason. The displacement of reason. Flavel says, when fear is exceedingly great, reason is displaced and unable to guide us. Fear often doesn't make sense, does it? But it feels like it does. We become like sailors in a storm, whom the psalmist describes as at their wits' end in Psalm 107. Their fear, Flavel says, impedes the aid of reason to such an extent that their counsels are always uncertain and at a loss. A person's usual cry in this condition is this: I don't know what to do. I don't know which way to turn. There's an indecisiveness. So the picture it's had here is that fear comes like a stinger. It displaces all of your reason. It might be lighting up your conscience. You're in a state of panic. You can't even think straight. You're almost paralyzed. What do? I can't decide. Flavel says that this type of fear, if experienced in the extreme, displaces your reason. Have you ever had a thought that to you seems super rational? Fear is at the core, the what ifs of your life. And you talk it out loud, or you talk to somebody and there's like that doesn't, simply stated, doesn't make any sense, right? You're not being rational, you're not being logical about it, and such is the nature of fear. It's our experience of it. He also says that there's an aspect of torment. Torment. This is a perpetual agitation of mind, a nagging, a perpetual nagging. 1 John 4:18. It's an obsessive nagging that we can't just seem to shake off or shake away. And it wears us down. It wears us down by that perpetual, almost obsessive nagging. Our souls, at the end of these battle matches, boxing matches with fear, right? Drugged down, we're exhausted. Flavel says, thirdly, that it is proportionate to proximity. I don't think he uses that term. That's my term. It's proportionate to proximity. He says on page 10 of his book, to hear of fire, plague, or sword, so war, in a foreign country does not frighten us because the evil is so remote. So it's out there, right? However, when it is in our town or even our home, so more localized, we tremble. Flavel, that's page 10. Now this is an obvious observation, right? Anything you're closer to in reality is going to register, in a sense, a more real response. But Flavel's seeking to bring precision to his definition by articulating the human experience. He also discusses this aspect of proximity in terms of our rationale for not wanting to think about death, for instance. Death is not terrifying for us in many cases until it comes closer to home. It gets real, right? Whether we're battling with something personally that might very well lead to our death, or whether someone who's close to us is wrestling with something that might lead to death, or in fact dies, it gets real. It gets more real, doesn't it? Right. And so, he also goes on to point out, too, that there's a consequence to this, not the person of sensuality, the person who always wants to feel good, feel happy, that sort of thing, kind of suppresses every bad thought that there might be so that they don't feel any pain. They actually end up not contemplating death and doing their soul a disservice, because if you're not contemplating death, you're not forced to ask the question, what happens after death? What causes death? Why is there death? And of course, you're escaping the question of sin, and in escaping the question of sin and seeking to escape it, you're also missing the mercy of God, faith in Christ, that faith that alone saves us, right? Now, thirdly, biblical and historical examples of this natural fear. Okay, biblical and historical examples of natural fear. The first he uses several times in this section is the example of Jesus. Jesus was a natural fearer. Now, again, what I mean by that, based on Flavel's definition, is that he was subject to these types of natural fears that we are subject to, though he himself was not, of course, sinful. Flavel says on page 9 of his book, it pleased our Lord Jesus Christ to subject himself to natural fear in the days of his flesh. He was afraid, even sore amazed, as Mark says in Mark chapter 14, verse 33. Although his human nature was absolutely free from sin, he came in the likeness of sinful flesh. And then he goes on to say, and this is key, especially when it comes to this idea of torments of conscience, the wrath of God, death, and all the fear natural that's associated with it. He grappled with a far greater evil than the terrors of death, namely the pouring out of God's wrath fully and immediately upon him. Christ's conflict with it was so great that it made him sweat, as it were, great drops of blood. That's how affiliated or associated Jesus was with this natural fear, according to Flavel's definition. Now, in terms of application, this is a question for us, right? How might this help us in our wrestlings with fear? What are we to do with this knowledge of Christ practically? I mean, the answer lies in the book of Hebrews, somewhere around chapter 4. But what do we do with this? You ever think of Jesus as a natural fear? Not a sinful fear, and we'll get to the distinction between the two in just a second. But he was faced with torment. He experienced torment. Wasn't defeated by torment, but he experienced it. What do we do with that? Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And keeping yeah. And right. Yeah. And some of you're doing great. I mean, some of it hitting ahead even into the sinful fear section, but yeah, all of those statements are true. And keeping the over Eric, go ahead.
One thing we can take away is we should evaluate our fear first, not always as a sin.
Right.
Not look onto our conscience and not make guilt. Just because we're afraid doesn't automatically.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the thing this is the interesting thing about the Puritans' precision, right? Oftentimes they have this sort of negative reputation where if we're, and sometimes I think it's justified in some cases. We talked about the legalisms and stuff like that last time. But, precision also helps alleviate false guilt, right? If we can categorize these things to a certain extent, although we can't evaluate our own hearts perfectly, right? It gives us different ways to approach things, to pray about things, right? We're always going to be praying. Lord, I'm naturally fearing. Are we not going to pray when we're naturally fearing? Of course we're going to pray when we're naturally fearing, that we might not slip into the realm of sinful fear, right? Natural fear is always the start of it. Yeah, very good, very good. So the precision, the distinctions can actually help us alleviate a false sense of guilt. Very true. Okay, what else? Wyatt. Yeah, that's right. Say again. Psalm 56. I wrote my Hebrew exegesis paper on Psalm 56. Yes, you get a gold star, Wyatt. So yeah, when I'm afraid, David is great at acknowledging, right, his own soul. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. And I would say in that case, he's wrestling with, I would say, a natural fear. If not, as you reading the rest of the psalm, he's like, I'm slipping into a little sinful fear. If you read the historical accounts that Psalm 56 is based upon, David